Daniel had always dreamed of being the best father he could be. From the moment his daughter, Lily, was born, he felt a love stronger than anything he had ever known. She was his world, his little sunshine who brightened even the darkest days. He worked hard to give her everything she needed, from bedtime stories to warm hugs when she was scared. But life had not been easy for them. Lily's mother, Vanessa, had once been the love of his life. They had planned a future together, filled with happiness. But as time passed, Vanessa changed. She became distant, distracted, and careless with their little girl. Daniel noticed how she would forget to pick Lily up from school or leave her alone for hours. It broke his heart. He tried to help, tried to make things work, but Vanessa didn't seem to care. She wanted a different life, one without responsibilities. Eventually, she left. Daniel begged her to think about Lily, but Vanessa made her choice. She walked away, leaving Daniel as the sole parent. It was hard, but he never gave up. He worked 2 jobs, sacrificed his sleep, and did everything he could to make sure Lily had a stable home. But just when things started to get better, Vanessa came back, this time with someone new. His name was Greg, and from the moment Daniel met him, he had a bad feeling. Greg was charming on the outside, but there was something about him that didn't seem right. He was too controlling, too eager to make decisions for Vanessa and Lily, even though he had no right to. Then came the worst part. Vanessa suddenly wanted Lily back. She claimed she had changed and deserved another chance. Daniel knew the truth. She wasn't interested in being a mother. It was Greg who was pushing her to do this. He didn't know why, but he could feel it in his gut. A long and painful custody battle began. Daniel fought with everything he had, proving that Lily was better off with him. He gathered evidence, showed the court how he had been the one raising her, how Vanessa had been absent. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. Lily, too young to understand, would ask him, "Daddy, why do I have to go to court?" Daniel would smile, holding back his tears, and tell her, "Because Daddy loves you and will always fight for you." After months of hearings, the judge finally ruled in Daniel's favor. He was granted full custody, and Vanessa was given only supervised visits. Daniel felt like he could finally breathe again. He had won. Lily was safe. Or so he thought. Because unknown to him, Greg and Vanessa were already planning something terrible, something that would turn his world upside down. And when it happened, it would leave everyone in shock. It was a bright Saturday afternoon, and Daniel was getting ready to welcome Lily home. She had gone for a short visit with her mother, as allowed by the court. He had packed her favorite snacks, set up her little tea party table, and even picked out a new storybook to read before bedtime. But as the hours passed, something felt wrong. Lily was supposed to be back by 3 p.m. It was now almost 5 p.m., and there was no sign of Vanessa or Greg. At first, Daniel tried to stay calm. Maybe they were just running late. Maybe traffic was bad. But deep down, a strange fear was growing inside him. He picked up his phone and called Vanessa. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. His hand started shaking as he sent a message. "Where is Lily? She was supposed to be home 2 hours ago." No reply. His heart pounded faster. He tried Greg's number, but it was disconnected. That's when the panic truly set in. He rushed to Vanessa's house, hoping to find them there. But when he arrived, the place was empty. The curtains were drawn, the car was gone, and the mailbox was overflowing, as if no one had been there for days. Daniel knocked on the door. No answer. He banged harder, shouting, "Vanessa, Greg, where is Lily?" But the only response was silence. A neighbor peeked out from their front porch and hesitated before walking up to Daniel. "I saw them leave early this morning," the old woman said. "They had bags with them, like they were going on a long trip." Daniel's stomach dropped. A long trip? That didn't make sense. Lily was supposed to be home hours ago. He felt his breath quicken as he realized the truth. They had taken her. Without wasting a second, Daniel called the police, his voice shaking as he explained the situation. "They took my daughter. I have full custody. They're not supposed to take her anywhere without permission." But when the officer arrived, his expression was calm, too calm. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but this sounds like a custody dispute. It's not considered an emergency unless we have reason to believe the child is in danger." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "They kidnapped her," he shouted. "They're not supposed to have her overnight. They disappeared." The officer sighed. "We'll file a report, and if they don't return her soon, we can take further action." Further action? How could they not see what was happening? Every second that passed meant Lily was further away. Daniel's hands curled into fists, his mind racing. He had trusted the system before, but now he saw the truth. If he waited, if he did nothing, his daughter could be lost forever. No, he couldn't just stand by. If the police wouldn't act fast enough, he would have to find Lily himself. And no matter what it took, he was going to bring her home. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing. The police had filed a report, but they weren't treating it like an emergency. They had told him to wait. How could he wait? His little girl was gone, taken by people he didn't trust, and every passing second made it harder to find her. He took a deep breath and forced himself to think. If the police weren't going to act fast, he had to. He had to find her. But where would Vanessa and Greg have taken her? He grabbed his phone and started going through old messages, emails, anything that might give him a clue. Then he remembered something. A few weeks ago, Vanessa had mentioned Greg's brother, Mike. She had casually said something about him living in a small town a few hours away. At the time, Daniel hadn't thought much of it, but now it seemed like an important piece of the puzzle. Without wasting a second, he opened his laptop and searched for Mike's name. It took some digging, but eventually he found an address linked to him. The town was far, almost a 6-hour drive, but it was the only lead he had. If there was even a small chance that Lily was there, he had to go. Daniel packed a bag, grabbed a few essentials, and got in his car. He barely slept that night, but his exhaustion didn't matter. All that mattered was finding Lily. As he drove, his mind was filled with memories of her. Her little giggles, the way she hugged him tight before bed, how she always said, "Daddy, you're my hero." He couldn't let her down. The road stretched endlessly before him, but his determination never wavered. He made a few calls while driving, reaching out to anyone who might have information. He even contacted Vanessa's old friends, hoping one of them knew where she had gone. Most of them had no idea, but one of them hesitated before saying, "I did hear Vanessa talking about getting a fresh start, somewhere quiet." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. That only made him more certain. She was hiding Lily in that small town. As the sun started to rise, he finally arrived at the location he had found online. It was a rundown house on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by thick trees. He parked his car at a distance, his heart pounding. He couldn't just barge in. He had to be careful. Looking around, he noticed a small playground in the yard. And then, through the window, he saw a glimpse of something that made his breath catch. A tiny figure, a little girl. It was Lily. She was there. But now, the real challenge began. How was he going to get her back? Daniel's heart pounded as he sat in his car, staring at the small house in the distance. His little girl was inside. He had seen her, just for a second, but that was enough to know he was in the right place. After hours of driving, of searching, of feeling hopeless, he had finally found her. But now came the hardest part. How was he going to get her back? He couldn't just walk up to the house and knock on the door. Greg was dangerous, and Vanessa had already proven she wasn't willing to do the right thing. If they saw him, they would run again, and this time he might never find them. He had to be smart. He had to be careful. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and tried calling the police again. "I found my daughter," he told them urgently. "She was taken from me, and I know where she is." But just like before, the officer on the other end spoke in a calm, frustrating voice. "Sir, we understand your concern, but unless there is evidence of immediate danger, we can't intervene without proper legal action." Daniel clenched his jaw. More waiting. More red tape. He couldn't afford to wait. Lily needed him now. He got out of the car and moved closer to the house, staying hidden behind the trees. From this distance, he could see more clearly. The curtains were drawn, but there was a small gap in one window, just enough for him to peek inside. He crouched low and slowly made his way forward, his pulse racing. When he reached the side of the house, he carefully looked through the gap. His heart clenched at what he saw. Lily was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. She looked scared. Her usually bright eyes were filled with sadness. Vanessa was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while Greg paced back and forth, talking angrily to someone. Daniel felt rage bubble inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't let his emotions take over. He had to think. Suddenly, he saw Lily lift her head and glance toward the window. For a moment, their eyes met. Daniel quickly put a finger to his lips, silently telling her not to make a sound. Lily's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time, a tiny bit of hope flickered in them. Daniel knew he had to act fast. He couldn't do this alone, but he also couldn't wait for the slow-moving system to help him. He needed a plan. He stepped back and took out his phone again, this time calling someone else, an old friend who had once worked as a private investigator. "I need your help," Daniel said. "I found Lily. Now I just need to get her out." His friend didn't hesitate. "Tell me where you are. I'm on my way." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. He wasn't giving up. No matter what it took, he was bringing his daughter home. Daniel's hands were shaking as he ended the call. Help was on the way, but every second felt like an hour. He stayed hidden among the trees, his eyes locked on the house where his daughter was being kept. Lily was so close, yet so far. Inside, he could still see Greg pacing back and forth, his face twisted in frustration. Vanessa sat quietly, barely looking at their daughter. It was clear that she wasn't the one making the decisions. Greg was. That made Daniel even more worried. Then, suddenly, Greg grabbed a set of car keys and marched toward the door. Daniel's heart pounded. Was he leaving? If Greg was out of the way, maybe he could get to Lily faster. Greg stormed outside, grumbling to himself, and got into a truck parked near the house. The engine roared to life, and within seconds he was gone, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Daniel exhaled. That was one problem out of the way. Now it was just Vanessa and Lily inside. His phone buzzed. It was his friend, Mark, the private investigator. "I'm 2 minutes away," Mark said. "What's the situation?" "Greg just left. Only Vanessa and Lily are inside," Daniel whispered. "We might not get a better chance than this." Mark arrived moments later, parking his car a little further down the road. He got out, dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly but cautiously. He was calm, experienced, exactly the kind of help Daniel needed. "We need to get her out without causing a scene," Mark said. "If Vanessa cooperates, this will be easy. If not, we have to be ready." Daniel took a deep breath. It was time. They approached the house quietly. Daniel knocked on the door, his heart racing. After a few moments, Vanessa opened it. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw him standing there. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" she stammered. "Where is Lily?" Daniel asked, his voice firm but calm. "You know this isn't right, Vanessa. You're breaking the law by keeping her here." Vanessa glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Greg, he said we needed to leave. He told me it was the only way." Daniel could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't as sure about this as Greg was. He decided to push further. Do you really think this is what's best for Lily? She's scared, Vanessa. She doesn't belong here. You know that. Tears welled up in her eyes, but before she could respond, a small voice called from inside. Daddy? Lily. Daniel's heart nearly burst. He stepped forward, and before Vanessa could say anything else, Lily ran straight into his arms. He hugged her tightly, feeling her tiny arms wrap around his neck. Shed, it's okay, baby. Daddy's here, he whispered. Vanessa wiped her eyes. Just go, before Greg comes back. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He lifted Lily into his arms, and without looking back, rushed toward the car. But just as they reached the road, headlights appeared in the distance. Daniel's heart pounded as he saw the headlights growing closer. Greg was coming back. They had only seconds to escape. He tightened his grip on Lily, holding her close as she buried her face in his shoulder. Mark reacted quickly. Get in the car. Now, he said firmly. Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran to Mark's car, carefully but quickly placing Lily in the back seat. Buckle up, sweetheart, he said gently, trying to keep his voice calm even though panic was rising inside him. Just as Daniel shut the door, Greg's truck came to a screeching stop in the driveway. The driver's door flew open, and Greg jumped out, his face red with anger. Hey, what do you think you're doing? Greg shouted. He marched toward them, fists clenched. Vanessa stood frozen on the porch, her face pale. She looked between Greg and Daniel, clearly torn. Daniel stepped forward, standing between Greg and the car. I'm taking my daughter home, he said, his voice steady. You have no right to keep her here. Greg laughed bitterly. Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it? He took another step forward. You think you can just walk in here and take her? Mark, standing beside Daniel, spoke in a calm but firm voice. Actually, he can. He pulled out his phone and held it up. The police are already on their way. You took a child without legal rights. If you lay a hand on anyone here, that's only going to make things worse for you. Greg's smirk faltered for just a second. He looked at Mark, then at Vanessa. Tell them, he snapped at her. Tell them she belongs with us. Vanessa didn't answer. She just looked down, her hands shaking. Greg turned back to Daniel, his eyes burning with anger. You think you've won. This isn't over. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't care about Greg's threats. All that mattered was getting Lily home safely. Mark leaned in. We need to go. Now. Without another word, Daniel got into the car. Mark jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. The tires kicked up dust as they sped down the road, leaving Greg shouting behind them. Daniel looked back at Lily, who was still clutching his arm. Are you okay, baby? He asked softly. She nodded but didn't let go. I was scared, Daddy, she whispered. Daniel kissed the top of her head. I know, sweetheart, but you're safe now. I promise. As they drove, the tension slowly began to fade. But Daniel knew this wasn't over yet. He still had to make sure Greg couldn't come after them again. And for that, he would need more than just a fast getaway. Daniel kept looking in the side mirror, his body still tense. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Greg wasn't going to let them go so easily. Mark drove fast but steady, keeping his eyes on the road. We're not safe yet, he muttered. We need to get somewhere secure before we figure out our next move. Lily was curled up in the back seat, holding tightly onto Daniel's hand. Are we going home now, Daddy? She asked in a small voice. Daniel turned to her, forcing a gentle smile. Yes, sweetheart. We're going home soon. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't that simple. Greg was furious, and if the police didn't act quickly, there was no telling what he might do next. Daniel needed a plan to make sure Lily was protected for good. Just as they neared the highway, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. It's a message from one of my contacts. Greg is already making calls, telling people you kidnapped Lily. Daniel's grip on his daughter's hand tightened. "He's lying," he said through gritted teeth. Mark nodded. "Of course he is. But you know how these things work. If he tells the police his version of the story first, things could get complicated." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. After everything Greg had done, he still had the nerve to twist the truth. But Daniel wasn't going to let him win. He had fought too hard to protect Lily. "Take me to the police station," Daniel said firmly. Mark shot him a surprised look. "Are you sure? We could go somewhere safe first." "No," Daniel said, shaking his head. "I want to be the first one to tell them what really happened. If Greg is spreading lies, I need to make sure the truth is heard before he causes more trouble." Mark nodded and changed direction, heading straight for the nearest police station. When they arrived, Daniel carried Lily inside. The officers at the front desk looked up in surprise. Before they could say anything, Daniel spoke. "I need to report a crime. My daughter was taken from me illegally. I have full custody, and I just got her back." One of the officers stood up, his expression turning serious. "Let's get you into a private room." As they sat down, Daniel showed them all the documents proving he had legal custody of Lily. He explained everything: how Greg and Vanessa had disappeared with her, how he tracked them down, and how Vanessa had let Lily go. The officers listened carefully, taking notes. Then one of them nodded. "We'll issue an immediate order against Greg. If he tries to come near you or Lily again, he'll be arrested." Daniel let out a long breath of relief. He wasn't going to let his guard down yet, but at least now, the law was on his side. And soon, he and Lily would finally be safe. Daniel sat in the small police station office, holding Lily close as the officer finished writing down his statement. His heart was still racing, but for the first time in days, he felt a sense of control. He had done everything he could to make sure Lily was safe. The officer looked up. "We've sent out an alert. If Greg comes near you or your daughter again, he will be arrested immediately. You've done the right thing by coming here first." Daniel nodded, relief washing over him. But he knew Greg wouldn't give up so easily. He had to stay prepared. Mark, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "What about Vanessa? Will she face any trouble for taking Lily?" The officer sighed. "That depends. If she willingly let the child go and cooperates with the investigation, she may not face serious charges. But if Greg tries to involve her again, things could change." Daniel thought about Vanessa's face when she told him to leave. She had looked scared. Maybe, deep down, she had realized she had made a mistake. As they wrapped up the paperwork, an officer stepped into the room with a serious expression. "Greg was just arrested," he said. "He showed up at the station a few minutes ago, demanding we file charges against you." Daniel felt his stomach twist. The officer continued, "But when we ran his name, we found out he already had a record, past complaints, reports of aggressive behavior. Once we compared your custody documents with his false claims, we knew he was lying. He's in custody now." A breath Daniel didn't even realize he was holding finally escaped. It was over. Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, we can go home now, right?" Daniel looked down at his daughter, her innocent eyes filled with hope. He smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yes, sweetheart, we can go home." Mark patted Daniel on the back. "You did good, man. Lily's safe, and Greg's exactly where he belongs." Daniel picked Lily up and walked toward the exit, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars above shined brightly, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. As they drove home, Lily eventually fell asleep in the back seat, her tiny hand still gripping Daniel's shirt. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. No matter how hard things got, no matter what challenges came his way, he would always fight for her. When they finally reached home, Daniel carefully carried Lily inside, tucking her into bed. She stirred slightly, opening her sleepy eyes. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. Daniel's eyes softened as he kissed her forehead. "I love you too, baby, always," as he sat by her side, watching her sleep peacefully. He knew one thing for sure: no one would ever take her away from him again.